Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back VentureBeat's Director of Marketing, Stuart Rogers.
Hey, hey. How are we doing? Is everyone suitably fed and watered? Woo, we got a woo. That's somebody who's had coffee over there, ladies and gentlemen. So, first session, it's going to be an awesome session, I can tell you that for nothing. I would like to welcome to the stage Jason Rubin, head of worldwide studios for Oculus VR, and he's going to be interviewed by Geoff Keighley, founder of the Game Awards. Please give them a warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, wow, how do we, so I sit here?
Probably there.
All right, we'll be close.
I won't
bite. Works well. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello to everyone here at GamesBeat, and hello to all of you watching live on Twitch. I'm excited to be here to interview a good friend of mine, Jason Rubin, who is at Oculus now, which is a company everyone's talking about and buzzing about, but Jason has had a long history in the video game business. I think I first played his games back when they were making them for the stduio and Way of the Warrior, which I still have a T-shirt for Way of the Warrior.
That was almost 10 years into game making, so.
Exactly, I know.
Nothing good before that.
I was too young before. I was like 13 then or something. But so Jason has a long history in games, making games, well known for founding Naughty Dog, which is one of the best game development studios in the world right now, and is working on Uncharted 4. But he left that all behind, did a lot of other interesting things, sort of in and out of gaming and entertainment. But then you came back to games for Oculus.
Once a developer, always a developer, I think, right?
Well, and so let's talk about, you and I over the years have always talked about, what was going to take you to sort of get back into games. You had ideas for games you wanted to make, you didn't make. After you left Naughty Dog, you left, you put a great succession plan in place. That studio is on fire. But why, let me ask you about the idea of just VR in general. What was the moment for you at being this game maker that had worked for so many years on games? Do you remember the moment when you sort of first put on VR? Were you an instant believer in it?
Absolutely. Brendan called me down. He's the CEO of Oculus, and he said, "You really need to see this thing." And I went, assuming that I wouldn't be that impressed. I've seen a lot of technology over the years, but I put it on, and I was an instant believer. I've said this before. I got into games to make worlds. I walked out of Star Wars at 7 years old and wanted to be George Lucas. I think every game maker has wanted to create worlds. And after 20 years of creating flat experiences, I kind of got, not tired of it, but I had done the same thing long enough that I wanted to take some time off. And seeing VR and the ability to actually create a world that's around you that you're completely immersed in was what got me excited to get back into games on a full-time basis.
And what's interesting is back then, they weren't interactive, right? It was just being able to look around, and that was enough for you to just, that the level of immersion was enough to excite you about what the gameplay could eventually be? Yeah,
the promise is there. Yeah. People talk about presence, and it's one of those wishy-washy terms. No one's really defined it, but there's a moment in the demo that I got a year and a half ago now, almost 2 years ago now, where you're at the edge of a building. And I've given that demo now hundreds of times since, and I stepped off the building, but it took a conscious decision to override my instincts not to. Right. And 9 out of 10 people or more that I've given that demo, I can't coach them to step off the virtual building. Right. You say, look, you were in a room 15 minutes ago, you know you're not at the edge of a building, we would never kill you, I'm gonna hold your hand in the real world, just take a step forward. And most people say, I get it, I'm not gonna do it. I understand what you're saying. I know I'm not going to be, I can't. And that, even though it wasn't interactive, even though there was no long-term gameplay, there was no compulsion loop, there was no feeling of achievement, all of those things that games will bring to it, I knew at that moment, if I can make you afraid to walk off a building, I can sell you anything. I can make you believe that you're in an alternate universe.
This pen. All right. So Oculus showed you that demo. You got excited about what they were doing. Maybe we should sort of let people know kind of what your role is at Oculus and how you're involved in this. So you said, you're a developer first, you like making games. There are a lot of really interesting people at Oculus, but your role in Oculus Studios, you're actually making and funding internal sort of first-party games at Oculus?
Yeah, my title is head of studios, so I'm in charge of all of what we call the lighthouse titles that Oculus is funding and working on. We have a production group. We're trying to share best practices among many developers and explore the infinite possibilities that VR brings, 10, 20 titles at a time, and figure out what works and what doesn't work. VR has very unique challenges. When I started making Crash Bandicoot, Andy and I decided, my partner Andy and I decided that we were going to make a character action game work in 3D. And most people don't realize how big a challenge that was. It hadn't really been done up until that point, and a lot of what Mario and Donkey Kong Country and Sonic relied on in terms of precision jumping and everything else just doesn't translate into 3D. You can't judge the distance, especially because it was 2D 3D. It wasn't actually stereo. It was just polygons that were rendered in 3D. And it took us a year of R&D to get to the point where we created Crash. And a lot of what we did was determined by the hardware we were dealing with. So for example, Crash is mostly an in and out game, whereas our competitor, Miyamoto-san, who of course, legendary game designer, created a game where you run around much more freely. The reason for that difference is very simple. He decided he wanted an analog stick and released the first analog stick. We were stuck with the old school digital pad. PlayStation launched with digital. We had in and out, left and right, because that's what we were given. This challenge reminds me a lot of that, amplified. Everything you do, you can't rely on what you've learned in the past in game making. Everything has to be discovered anew. For the first time, you have the ability to make someone feel uncomfortable in VR. And that's much bandied about as if it will be somehow a barrier to VR. It's actually not a barrier. It is a challenge, to be sure, but there are so many things you can do outside of that realm, outside of the space at which you feel uncomfortable, that it's really a question of filling that space and then moving in around the edges and figuring out, how do we make a character action game in 3D? How do we move that character action game into VR? Very similar. So I got that feeling that I hadn't had since Crash Bandicoot of discovering the new. And that made it really exciting for me and worthwhile doing. And I get to work on many projects as opposed to a single one. As a developer, I'm a producer, so I get to dip my head in and out and work on many projects. And it's amazing seeing the little tiny inventions that someone comes up with. Sniper rifles don't work well in VR because imagine your vision suddenly is 10x magnified. You wouldn't be able to walk. High voltage, working on a game called Damage Core, solved that problem and did it in a way that doesn't make you uncomfortable. So they've solved that, right? And we're moving into all these little areas that people say, you can't do that kind of game. We'll figure it out. They'll be different, to be sure, but we'll figure out how to get there.
So how much of your stuff right now is experimental, sort of trial and error, sort of experiments versus actual products that, you want to ship and bring to market?
Most of what we're doing is products.
Yeah.
Michael Abrash gave a speech at Connect about the future of VR, and he was saying how far we have to go and how each challenge from inner ear to eye to smell, all of these things about VR, they each have their own challenges, and we don't know how long it's going to take, and we're working towards it, and it's this long journey. I live in the opposite world. Yeah. I go to a developer and I say, you want to do a sports game? I want to do a sports game. Here's your budget, here's your timeline. We don't know how the hell this is going to work, but I want football, basketball, baseball, and hockey, go. And then we have to backfill into that. And amazingly, we've been able to do that. We have we've shown hockey, we've shown on the screen football. It's amazing. I mean, you're a quarterback. You get it, you pass the ball, and then you become the receiver and actually catch the ball. So it's very, very much centered around making products, getting to products.
So I think, for a lot of people here that may be in development or thinking of companies in VR, we see an explosion of sort of investment in, VR. But I think a lot of people are wondering about, what is the addressable market going to be? It's like, Oculus can obviously afford to sort of forward invest into some of these games and not necessarily think about the P&L right off the get-go for software. But when you think of the sort of go-to-market strategy for games and developers, a lot of people are jumping in right now. But, do you think, does the math work in terms of, how many people have to work on these games, for how long, for how many headsets are going to be out there? A year or two from now?
I thought that the challenge in my job when I started was going to be convincing developers to make this leap. Yeah. And basically, I've kind of gone at it in two ways. The first way is to say, remember when touch games first came out? And people said, that's never going to work. How many people are going to want to play on phones? And a lot of the industry just kind of ignored it. But a few developers, for whatever reason those specific developers had, decided to jump in at a time when nobody knew if there was a business there. And some of them became Rovio. Yeah. Some of them were early enough that they had that hit that became massive. And there was a lot of trial and error. at Rovio, a lot of failed games before they hit Angry Birds. What they learned gave them the ability to get there, and we're now in the multiple generations of learning and getting ahead. This is the single largest learning curve I've ever seen in games, and I've been in the business. Naughty Dog celebrated its 30th anniversary last year, so I've been in at least 30 years in the game industry. Single largest challenge. It is also, it feels like an inevitability to everybody that uses it. So if you believe this is inevitable, and if you believe that this is a hard challenge, getting in early and failing a few times, perhaps financially failing a little bit, struggling, making sure you make ends meet, is the best way to give yourself a shot at the next gold rush in the industry. Because the gold rush is not there anymore in mobile, at least from my perspective. It's very, very hard to get there. So that's one way, and you know, people have been very accepting of that concept. The second way that I've won hearts and minds is putting them in VR. And the minute you do that, they want to do it. And the most important indication of the success of VR to me has been the fact that every single developer that I have signed at Oculus has asked me to do a second title and is either signed or is pitching to do second titles. Right. And many developers, some of them quite large, well-known developers, have said, listen, we're winding down our other contracts over time, we're all in on VR. Not a single developer that I've worked with has said, after this game, I think I'm going to go back to doing something else. Right. It is incredibly compelling. And if all the developers we're working with buy in, it's going to create the content that brings the audience.
So are you going to get into VR? Are we going to have a Jason Rubin game?
I'm very happy doing what I'm doing right now. I consider all of them my children, but I raise them from afar. I don't know. Who knows? But right now, I'm really, really happy jumping from project to project and helping solve the little problems as they move towards launch.
Now, you mentioned sort of the mobile gold rush may be over, but there's, I think, an interesting conversation to be had about mobile VR versus the Rift. And I mean, there's Gear VR out there. It's been out there. There's a new one coming out. What's your view on sort of the ultimate way that people are, or at least the first way that a mass amount of people are going to experience VR? Do you think, is it going to be through mobile, or do you think it's going to be through a headset like the Rift?
That's a really good question. And I think Oculus's answer is we believe in both. Right. Clearly. We have our partnership with Samsung. We're working very, very closely with them on Gear VR. We're extremely excited about that product. The $99 price point that was announced a couple of weeks ago is an incredibly compelling addition to a phone you already have to get you into VR. Yeah. It provides a really cool experience that surprises most people who put it on. They say, well, this is absolutely amazing. Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the Rift, which it provides this experience that is absolutely unforgettable. Everybody that puts it on remembers the first time they put it on. It's hard to say how VR pans out, but I would say right now, mobile is kind of starting at lower end and moving up, and Rift is starting at the high end and moving towards the middle. Yeah. And somewhere in the future, we end up with the perfect device that's at the right price point, that has the broad enough market that it becomes a huge success. How that exactly plays out, I don't know.
No, I mean, the Rift, obviously, not just the headset. You got to have a great computer to run it. I mean, there's a lot of barriers to entry there, and that's why I think the mobile experience, for those of you that have tried it, I mean, it is pretty compelling. When you're thinking about studios and games, where are developers going? Are you building games that work on both, or you have to bet on one or the other? Is it a combination? Or?
Again, it's been amazing. Sometimes you show the developer the Rift, they're like, this is absolutely unbelievable, and then they put on the Gear VR, and they're like, this is where I want to work. Right. This is the future. At other times, you give a developer the Rift and Gear VR, and they absolutely just want to work on Rift. So I think that's a developer preference.
Are you doing games that will be on both, too?
There are definitely games that are on both. The fundamental difference between the two is that there is no positional tracking right now on the mobile device. So it has 3 degrees of freedom. You can look around and see in any direction, but as you move forward, backwards, left, or right, it doesn't register that change. So as you run into a game, if you were to stand up, don't do this at home, if you were to stand up and run forward in your game, the whole world comes with you on Gear VR, whereas you will run into whatever you're running at on Rift. And that fundamentally changes some games. Some games don't work on one, some games don't work on other. But there are games, Hero Bound 2 and Hero Bound 1, third-person dungeon crawler that we did, work great on both.
Right. So when you think of sort of studios and where you're going to place your bets moving forward, I know you're working with a lot of cool developers. Maybe tell us, I mean, what are some of the titles that you're working on or the types of experiences that you want to build? You mentioned sports, but you've got some other stuff too, right?
Yeah, we're trying to hit the gamut. We have a lot of games that we call tabletop, for lack of a better word. RTSs would fall into that, MOBAs would fall into that. There's a weird feeling of like when you were a kid and you were playing with toys, when you're playing a game and looking down as a giant on a tabletop, again, for lack of a better term, that is incredibly compelling. You really feel like it's your little universe you're building. So we're working on a few of those games. We have third-person character action games, Edge of Nowhere from Insomniac, a bunch of others that are unannounced, Lucky's Tale from Playful, that are incredibly cool. The challenge there is you tend to focus on the character, so we're trying to invent ways to get the player to actually look around, because the power of VR is you have this, this giant universe to look around in at any given point. But third-person games have worked really well. Chronos is another one that we've announced, which is fantastic. And then we have the first-person adventures. Yeah. And then onto that, you have to layer input devices. So everything we've just talked about is headsets. Yeah. But our touch controller gives you an incredible ability to put your hands into space and reach out and kind of see them. And it has really, and yeah, you've used it. You can point and thumbs up and do things like that. And another thing to say, by the way, is that Facebook believes in social, and Facebook owns Oculus. There's a strong belief that social is going to be a huge part of VR's future. And we have demos right now where I can point over there, and you'll turn around and look at what I'm pointing at, even though we could be on different continents looking in different directions. It all just works with the 3D sound and the 3D visuals. We can play ping pong across giant chasms, and it really feels like I'm standing in front of you. The second presence moment that I experienced after the walking off a building was the first time that I went into what we call Toy Box, which is a multiplayer demo where you do nothing but pick up and mess with stuff. There's no game in it. And I'm a floating blue head, you're a floating blue head, we have floating blue hands. So it's just floating hands in a head. And if I walk at you, you will get that feeling of human fight or flight. What is this person doing? Why are they coming at me? Do I need to do something? And there's no other medium, no matter how, I watched Jurassic World last night on a flight. No matter how that dinosaur gets up to the TV, you're just like, okay, there's a dinosaur on the TV. When you see things in VR come at you, you get that feeling. And even though I'm a floating blue head, it has nothing to do with me, you'll recognize my body motions, you'll recognize me as human, and you'll react to me as if I was human. And so we're doing a lot with the touch controllers and the social interactions.
So when you say this, you paint an amazing picture of sort of, VR, how impressive it is. I mean, when you look at the traditional games business, I mean, is VR going to just wipe out, the traditional console business? I mean, is everything going to be in VR? Or do you think VR is just, it's cool for these short session experiences, but I'm still going to want to sit there and play Grand Theft Auto?
Yeah, the short session experience, I'm not sure is a truth. Like, there are things that I've done for many hours that I don't have a problem with. Right. But what I will say is there are some things that we're really good at doing in 2D games. And 30 years of Naughty Dog has created titles that are not all of a sudden going to go away. And a lot of those titles won't work in VR because of the locomotion issues and the comfort issues. But I still want to play those games. Right. And VR actually does an incredibly good job of letting me play those games on a 70-inch television with the best sound system in the world, sitting next to a friend. So I think that those games, nobody in VR space says, we're going to wipe out any other, like, you just don't hear that. No one in Oculus says, this is the end of anything. We think it amplifies and improves everything that's out there. We announced the Netflix app. Netflix is awesome in VR. It's a gigantic screen that most people can't afford to have in their house. And on a plane, it's with Wi-Fi, but if you download the movies, which is also a possibility, it's a great way to zone out and be in first class.
But so you do think those traditional 2D games will still exist, but you think everyone will be sort of viewing it through, they won't be watching on television, they'll be viewing it.
Maybe not everyone, but I have a 2.5-year-old daughter. I happen to love the Grand Theft Auto franchise. Right. I can play it right in front of her if I have a headset on. When I was going to college, I was stone cold broke. We were 3 people sharing a tiny little TV. I can put on an Oculus headset, plug it into my laptop, and I'm sitting in an amazing room watching television, again, with friends who are not in the room, avatars of my friends. I'm going to tune out my roommates. They're not there anymore. So I think there are a lot of times where it makes it better. We have an Xbox integration that plays through Rift, it's amazingly good. It really is a great way of playing it. And again, when you grew up, we would play Mario Kart next to each other on the sofa.
Yeah.
And we've lost the crap talking, right? We've lost the ability to look over and laugh at somebody in their face. Trust me when I tell you, even though you are an avatar, you're playing a gnome and I'm playing, a flaming chicken. When I look at you and I laugh, you get that, he just laughed at me.
Right.
You feel that. So going back to the Mario Kart party, even though we're not in the same room, is incredibly compelling. I think it makes everything better.
Everything better is in VR. All right, we will leave it there. Thank you, Jason Rubin. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of GamesBeat.
Anybody?